All right, it's 11 a.m. now. So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. We had heard Dr. Joseph Lobianco to give his meaningful keynote speech on language policy and social cohesion in multi-ethnic countries, the case of Southeast Asia. And there's more for today, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the panel session 2 of the conference, which team mother tongue-based multilingual education, experience in Southeast Asia country. And the chairperson of the panel is Dr. Kimmo Kosonen, specialist, Payap University, Chiang Mai, Thailand. And Dr. Kimmo Kosonen today also has another important role to play. He is also our first panelist. And secondly, we have Dr. Maria Mercedes Chas E. Arzadon, Assistant Professor, College of Education, University of the Philippines-Diliman. Then it's my honor to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Kirk, Director, External Affairs, SIL International, Mainland, Southeast Asia. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Jessica Ball, Professor, University of Victoria, Canada, as our last panelist. So without further ado, I will now pass the stage to Dr. Kimmo Kosonen. Over to you, Doctor. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone in Asia Pacific and Europe and Africa, and evening in Dr. Ball in Western Canada. Good evening. What we'll do in this session, we'll have a total of 2 hours. And I will first define some key concepts that we'll be using. And some of them have already been covered by Dr. Hugh and Dr. Lobianco. And then I will give general overview of multilingual education movement in Southeast Asia. And I will refer to a few national cases very briefly. And then we will have 3 more extensive case studies on 3 countries where there's more multilingual education activities happening currently than elsewhere. And we will cover the Philippines, Thailand, and Cambodia. And so just like in other sessions, I ask you to hold your questions and preferably use the Mentimeter. And after my own session or my own presentation, I will be checking on the Mentimeter so that then I'll try to pick up the questions that are most relevant, and so that each of the panelists can address some questions. So in addition to my introduction, I'm also a senior consultant with SIL International. It's in some of the documentation, but so I work both at Payap University and SIL International, and I'm joining this session from Chiang Mai, Thailand. So we already covered a little bit of linguistic diversity in the world, and it's been referred to, that there are 7,000 or more languages spoken in the world today. Several people have referred to this number, and here on this map I've stated how many languages are estimated to be spoken in different world regions. And so, as you see, Asia has more languages than any other world region. Of course, Asia has more population, a larger population than other regions. If we focus on Southeast Asia, the 11 countries here, we have observed that there's about 1,200 plus languages spoken in these 11 countries. We'll come back to this. And so, like I said, after this, we will have a case study on the Philippines, Thailand, and Cambodia. And all of us, 4 speakers, have published on the themes that we are talking about today. And so here are a few links to papers that can be read online or downloaded. And if you want to know more about, for example, my talk, you can download this report. It's a little dated, but most of the things are still the same. In terms of the Philippines and Dr. Arzadon's presentation, you can check her website, and there's lots of resources on this. Then UNICEF has published reports on Thailand and Cambodia, and the authors are Dr. Persson and Dr. Ball. And you can download these very extensive reports, very detailed reports on multilingual education activities in Thailand and in Cambodia. And so in these 18 minutes that our colleagues will present, they can only scratch the surface. If you want to know more, you can read about the activities and analysis of the activities and policies in these reports. So I will define 3 terms here that have already been discussed to some extent. And I will justify why we are using these terms here rather than some other terms. We're not talking about minority languages here. And the reason, well, I've worked in Southeast Asia in all of these 11 countries over the past 20 years in language policy and multilingual education, advocacy, research, training, etc. And I've realized that the term minority or indigenous language or indigenous people, minority people, doesn't really cover all of the people and all of the languages that would need something like multilingual education. And so I've started using for the past 15 years term non-dominant language. And I define it by like this, that it's a number of speakers or prestige or official use of the government or education system. And so the reason for this, using this term NDL, and that's in my further slides, is that there are languages like these. These are the 13 largest language communities in the world that are minoritized. There's tens of millions of speakers, these languages, but they are not used in the government services to provide government services or in education. And in your neighboring, or I'm talking to Malaysia, so in Indonesia, the largest ethno-linguistic community is Javanese, almost 70 million speakers, but that language is not used in education. Same thing in Pakistan, the largest community, Western Punjabi, is not used in education or government, in government services, whereas that's the largest community in the country. Most of these languages here are, of course, as you see, different Chinese languages and different varieties of Arabic. But the distinction between these languages is as great as we have in between different European languages. There are 2 exceptions to Chinese. Cantonese is used as a language of instruction in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan, they use some of the Minnan Chinese or Taiwanese in their education system, which is dominated by Mandarin Chinese. So this is just an example that a minority language, these are not minority languages. And talking about minorities or indigenous people, we would neglect talking about the grievances of people speaking these languages as well. And I believe there's others here too who agree that everyone whose language is minoritized should be given the same rights as others. And here's just an example of Pakistan. The Western Punjabi is spoken by 48% of the population. It's not a minority language. It's a minoritized language, and we call it non-dominant language. So with my colleague Carol Benson, we've published or edited 2 books using these terms, looking at multilingual education and non-dominant languages in different parts of the world. If you're interested, you may want to look for these materials. So the second term is mother tongue or first language, L1, home language. And Dr. Hugh already discussed this and gave a lot of background and good insights into the term mother tongue and the problems, challenges using it. I've been using this UNESCO's definition that is quite broad. It's not only the language you learned in the home as your first language. It can be a language that you identify with, you know best, or you use most. So with this definition, we could say that that many people, multilingual people, can have several first languages. Also, the term multilingual education, we use a fairly broad definition. Again, this comes from the work of myself and my colleague Carol Benson in one of those books I introduced, where we consider multilingual education all activities if more than one language is used for instruction as well as for literacy, initial and ongoing. and also that different languages are studied as subjects. I mean, grammar or vocabulary, spelling, etc. Now, in this region, in some countries, especially Myanmar and Vietnam, we encounter programs where they say we are doing Mtbmle or bilingual education, whereas, for example, they don't have any literacy in more than one language. So that it's an activity where all the curriculum and materials are in the dominant language, but sometimes a teacher or teaching assistant helps translate some of the content into another language. And that's called bilingual education, or Mtbmle. By this definition and how I see it in Southeast Asia, I wouldn't say that that's real multilingual education. And we're using this definition in this session this morning. So let's go back to Southeast Asia. So as you know, it's 11 independent nations around Malaysia, north and east of Malaysia and south of Malaysia. And it's a major world region with 660 million people, with more than 1,200 languages spoken. And traditionally, the language policies in all of these countries have emphasized or privileged some of a few dominant languages, official or national languages. And I'll provide the details later. But over the past 20 years, there's been this movement towards multilingual education, MLE, and there's been official support for non-dominant languages in education in about half of these countries. And when we compare Southeast Asia to other regions of the world, we can see that the movement towards multilingual education is perhaps stronger than anywhere else in the world, which is very encouraging for us. And this region could be not a model, but could provide some inputs to similar movements arising in other parts of the world. And most widely taught foreign language in this region is English, which is an official language in a few of the countries. In terms of linguistic diversity, those 1,200 languages are divided by country here. Indonesia has more than 700. Brunei Darussalam has 16. Now, none of the countries are monolingual, but some of them act as if they were mono or bilingual in terms of education. And that is a challenge. And Dr. Lo Bianco raised some of the issues, what can happen when part of the population feel left out due to education and other policies. As you see, Malaysia is number 3 in terms of number of languages in Southeast Asia. But the Philippines, which is doing more on MLE than any other country in the region, has even more languages than Malaysia. So if it's doable in the Philippines, it could be doable in other countries of Southeast Asia as well. I use this framework to sometimes to address the issue that how the speakers of non-dominant languages and the members of ethno-linguistic minority communities are positioned in the language hierarchy. And often there is pressure on these languages and these communities from 3 sides. So that's English language as a result of globalization, and then nationalism. The national governments are putting pressure on introducing and teaching the national language, official language, to everyone. And then in this region, Mandarin Chinese is also having influence. And sometimes the parents think, and the community members think, that they have to choose between these 4 languages. But the MLE movement has shown that you can successfully learn several languages without losing any benefits. So multilingualism is the norm, and it could be used in education as well. If we have a more detailed look at all the 11 countries, I've divided them into 2 groups, like mainland Southeast Asian countries and then insular Southeast Asia. And you see that in mainland, each country has 1 official language, which represents the largest ethno-linguistic community of the nation. And the final column is perhaps most interesting, that clearly in Cambodia and Thailand, there is official support for non-dominant languages, and in Laos, there's a clear no. Whereas in Myanmar and Vietnam, we're not sure. We heard that the Myanmar is in a transition now due to the coup, and we don't really know whether the laws are applying, the formal laws of the former government are applying. But there is a lot of things happening in Myanmar run by communities. And in Vietnam, there's documents that support non-dominant languages, and then there's documents that prohibit the use of non-dominant languages. When we're coming to the island states, we have less clear positions by the government. Brunei is clearly no non-dominant languages, English and Standard Malay only, whereas the Philippines is supporting one of the largest multilingual education systems in the world, and the rest of the countries are somewhere in between. It's worthwhile to notice that in insular Southeast Asia, several countries have several official languages. In that report that I introduced earlier, I wrote to UNESCO. They asked me to assess the percentage of Southeast Asian pupils whose first language is used as a language of instruction. And I came up with this graph, and now I realize it's already a little dated, because there's been more languages have been included in the Philippines system. If you want to know more, please download the report. But we can say that in two countries, there's a very high percentage of students who can study in the language they speak in the home. That's Cambodia and Vietnam. The reason for this is because the population in those countries is about 90% represents the dominant group, Kamae, or the Kin, or the Vietnamese people. The rest of the countries are somewhere in between. And it's very, very difficult to give exact numbers of this, because we just don't have these data. We have countries like Indonesia and Brunei and Timor-Leste somewhere, low range, and almost everyone is learning in their second or third language. We have exact figures from few countries, and Timor-Leste is one of them. This is from the national census, and this is the only, only country with figures of this detail about language proficiency in the official school languages. And you see, from educational point of view, it doesn't really make much sense to use Portuguese for children, because less than 1% of children speak Portuguese when they enter grade 1. But more details about this in the actual report. And we cannot assess the percentage of children having access to first language-based instruction, because we need these kind of data in order to calculate percentages, and we just don't have these data in most countries. And some of these issues relate to what Dr. Hugh talked about yesterday, that what is the mother tongue, what are the mother tongues, and what is a person's proficiency in those languages. And we just don't have those data in most cases. So now I just want to quickly talk about MLE in the region until, and then we go into the case studies. So in these three countries that will be highlighted in the session, there's more languages used in education. More languages are represented in the official education system and elsewhere. And we will hear details about these countries later. We also need to note that in Myanmar and in Timor-Leste, there's also some non-formal and early childhood and pilot programs using lots of, or many non-dominant languages. In Timor-Leste currently, as far as I know, 3 languages. The other extreme is these countries, Brunei, Indonesia, Laos, and Singapore, where mostly just the dominant languages are used in education. Very quickly, a case study on Vietnam. It's because they have a particular political ideology based on Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninist ideas. The way public policy is perceived is a little different from other kinds of systems. And there's lots of policy documents, even earlier constitutions, that provide very strong support for non-dominant languages in education. But at the same time, there are laws like 2005 education law that says that Vietnamese is the only official language of education. And it's very difficult to know which document and which statement, which law, which decree, which act is above the others. And there's a lot of confusion whether you can actually do MLE or not. And there were some quite good multilingual education pilot programs, but I've learned that they have all been discontinued, and currently only some non-dominant languages are studied as subjects. I had another case, but I'm running out of time, so I'm skipping Laos and go into the issues, and then we could go to the cases. Overall, in the region, the governments, and especially ministries of education, have a tendency to try to assimilate everyone to the dominant community, and multilingual education and non-dominant languages are seen as sensitive issues. And in most cases, governments prioritize national or international languages, apart from those 3, 4, or 5 exceptions where we have the MLE movement. But we have to note that in Myanmar, for example, it's mostly local communities and international NGOs supporting MLE activities, not the federal government. And in many places, there is a lack of political will to do MLE. Then finally, when I've engaged with officials in all of these 11 countries, we often know that the decision makers have very limited understanding what first language-based education means and how it can be beneficial for overall educational achievement. Same with parents and teachers, and they often don't understand that using the first language can be a very good foundation for all further learning. And then we have implementation gaps, like I mentioned in Vietnam, that there's a policy that's maybe supportive, but there's very little practice. So there's rhetoric, but the reality is quite different. And in some countries, like in Cambodia, we see that there is good policy implementation for some communities, but not to all. And same in Malaysia, that there is small support for a few of the bigger, like Mandarin Chinese and Tamil, and few bigger non-dominant languages, but not to all non-dominant languages. And in the Philippines, we've seen that rapid expansion of MLE without proper planning or preparation or training of financial or human resources hindered successful implementation of the policy. And finally, if you want to know more, Professor Lo Bianco referred to the Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group in his talk this morning, and so I added this ad hoc at the last minute. If you want to know more about the MLE movement here, please visit this website, and you will. There's lots of information and links to other resources. So, kiitos, terima kasih, xie nandri, kopkun kap, thank you. And in my PowerPoint, I will have references to all of the documents that I cited. So next, we will have Dr. Maria Mercedes Chet Arzadon from the Philippines, and she was already introduced. She is currently an associate professor in the University of Philippines, and she's an activist and she's a researcher, and she's a practitioner too, and she's been very much heavily engaged in the MLE movement in the Philippines. Over to you, Chet.
Congratulations to our Malaysian friends for organizing this conference. I hope to show the recorded videos to my colleagues and students. And I hope that we Asians would have opportunities like this for mutual sharing and support for MLE. So I'm going to present the Philippine experience. I hope that you will learn valuable lessons from our gains and shortcomings. Here is the Philippine profile. As mentioned by Kimmo, we are the second most linguistically diverse in Asia with 182 living languages. And broad implementation means reaching almost 50,000 schools found in island and mountain villages. The Philippine public school system, introduced in 1900 by the American colonial government, allowed nothing but English in schools. The dropout rate was so high as 75% then. A major change in language policy took place in 1974 when Filipino, the national language, was added to English. After 34 years, in 2009, the Mtbmle was introduced in all 47,000 villages. However, through the years, starting in 1948, various experiments in multilingual education were introduced. Here is a listing of previous MLE-related initiatives organized by advocates within the Ministry of Education, NGOs like SIL, missions, CSO, and Indigenous people organization. It must be noted that the shift to Mtbmle happened because of strong advocacy from various sectors. Here's the manifesto that we floated in 2008, and I was surprised that after a few days, 200 have already signed. The advocates come from academics, mother tongue writers, indigenous child rights advocates, policymakers, and technocrats within the Congress and Ministry of Education. So language is a highly politicized issue marked by inter-ethnic conflicts due to the national language debates. And so the MLE campaign provided new opportunities to forge new partnerships. However, cooperation was often fragile, short-lived, and needed to be continuously nurtured. We had to limit discourse to shared goals like quality education. The factors that enabled the coming together of divergent groups in 2008 were the following. Because of the presence of online communities, I was a part of Yahoo group where I was socialized into Mtbmle. We were encouraged by UNESCO's recognition of the Philippine MLE experience in Labuagan, the pressure to meet the 2015 EFA goals, and there was this order by the president to use nothing but English. And so we came together to oppose that move. The next slide cites the features of the Mtbmle policies. First, it foregrounds the local and international research asserting that the use of the child's home language improve learning. The two Mtbmle policies, include the following provision: L1 as the language of learning from kindergarten to grade 3, subjects like mother tongue as a subject, then Filipino and English. The language of instruction shall also be the primary language for testing, provision of teachers training, localized materials development, and the content and pedagogy should be contextualized, localized, and indigenized. The two MLE policies that were issued seem similar, but a closer look reveals that the first policy in 2009 stated that the implementation shall be gradual, to be planned by a local technical working group. In 2013, the new K-12 curriculum was introduced, and it incorporated the Mtbmle as its main component. Thus, as the K-12 curriculum swept across the country, so did the Mtbmle program. Directions for the K-12 curriculum were largely emanating from the central office of the Ministry of Education. There were advantages and disadvantages of such swift implementation, broad implementation. Many of us allowed such rapid moves to happen because we were not sure if the next president and Minister of Education would show the same support for Mtbmle. One advantage of combining MLE and the new K-12 curriculum is the provision of strong policy support. Various department orders issued by the Ministry of Education attempted to institutionalize MLE in various parts of the whole basic educational system, like funding, materials development, organization, etc. The most notable for me was the integration of MLE in the teacher hiring and incentive structure. New teacher applicants for early grades and indigenous schools should demonstrate their capacity to use the local language in instruction. Teachers' performance evaluation system document the teachers' MLE initiatives, especially materials development and pedagogy, which become the basis for promotion and career advancement. And so in my study, I found that many MLE champions in the region were promoted rapidly. These are the first set of languages selected in 2012 as languages of learning. They were a mix of big, small, and indigenous languages. It must be noted that 90% of the Philippine population speak these languages. In 2018, the Filipino Sign Language became the 20th language to be used in school. How can new languages be added to the 20 official languages of learning? In response, the Ministry of Education provided the 4 minima, or the most essential requirements. The remaining small languages can be used if there is a writing system, a dictionary, grammar guide, and reading materials. There should also be a teacher who can speak the language. Early this year, the Philippine Ministry of Education reported that there are 46 additional languages that being evaluated and provided with the 4 minima. The Indigenous Peoples Education Office is undertaking this project. Making the policy work involved massive teachers training. It is interesting that the former trainers of the English-only program were the ones sent to Payap University in Thailand for 1 month Mtbmle training. The main trainer there was SIL representative Dr. Susan Malone. The MLE national trainers, along with the partners from the academy and NGOs, facilitated massive teachers training in the region, division, and district level. Here is one training in a school district, which includes workshop on teaching strategies in big book making. One bright spot on Mtbmle is its literature-based reading program, which utilizes teacher-made storybooks. It must be noted that in the past, the main strategy in reading instruction was the code-based approach. This involved drills and decoding of sounds and letters. Development agencies prescribe this impoverished approach for low-resource community. And so before Mtbmle, it was a normal sight to see bare classrooms with nothing but old blackboard and some pieces of old textbook. But this changed with the emergence of teacher-made storybooks, which enriched learning and generated excitement and high level of reading engagement among children. The policy that prescribed locally made storybooks changed a lot of things. My recent research was conducted in a school district in an indigenous community in northern Luzon, northern Philippines. After their MLE training, the school principal and teachers created something like a book supply chain or production line of storybook making involving storytellers from the community, editors, illustrators, and printers. Some schools had large printing machine and system of lamination in their principal's office. We see here that teachers at the field are vital policy actors in interpreting and enacting the policy based on their context. The big books feature stories about their vegetable farming experiences, indigenous knowledge, and practices. I was amused to hear pupils talk about their favorite storybooks. They said that they knew the name of the authors, who are their principal or teachers, and the illustrators, who is usually a classmate or an older sibling. The Ministry of Education uploaded in its portal the locally made mother tongue materials that pass the quality assurance process. They can be accessed freely. In addition to the government portal, which features 450 mother tongue materials, I found that there are other free access repositories of storybooks, including audiobooks. My students and I are creating a similar online library, but mainly for Philippine languages. A colleague found that these sites managed by the government and NGOs store at least 2,000 storybook titles. This number does not include the many more mother tongue storybooks produced by commercial publishers that are, and these books are being sold in several bookstores. This demonstrates how individuals and organizations are eager to contribute learning materials freely using their mother tongue and available technologies. Assessment of learning is one challenging area in the implementation. In 2015, the Ministry of Education introduced a grade 3 exit test in the 19 mother tongues. It was called Language Assessment for primary grades. In 2016, the name of the test was changed to Early Language Literacy and Numeracy Assessment to highlight that we aim to measure not just the language, but literacy and numeracy. From the 2015 test, we were surprised to discover that a language group in an island called Surigao Non were among the best performers. The latest initiative of the Ministry of Education and UNICEF is the Mtbmle Operations Manual. After 1.5 years, the manual is completed and is being reviewed. I was part of the writing team that documented the innovative practices and tools created by teachers and supervisors at the field. It was encouraging to meet many MLE movers from the field during our data collection and validation process events. We met the teachers from the small island in Surigao. In writing the manual, I sensed some gaps in the program. I realized that Mtbmle is strong in teaching basic literacy, but it needs to strengthen its approaches in cross-language transfer or bridging from L1 to L2. The manual has drawn lessons from various strategies like the Lailima method of Frederick Lupke, translanguaging practices of Ophelia Garcia and SIL's Dr. Sang Sok Sun. We included lessons, ideas from dual language program, the CLIL and the sheltered instruction approach or SIOP, and many more. We hope that the manual will be finalized soon and would assist teachers and school heads in addressing many challenges in their locale. Institutions outside the department or Ministry of Education have been supporting the program. Aside from the Commission of Filipino Language, which has been producing orthographies, the Commission of Higher Education has provided funding to universities that were interested in developing materials, Mtbmle materials for teacher education. It also issued a memo encouraging universities to integrate Indigenous studies or Indigenous education in their curricula. There is a growing number of universities and colleges that are offering Mtbmle and Indigenous education related courses in their undergraduate and graduate level. Here are some examples. Some provincial governments are persuaded by the teachers, by the teacher advocates, to support Mtbmle. So they, through deliberation and policymaking practices, they made local language more visible in public spaces like government facilities. They use the local language for meetings in transaction. They required local media to insert more programs. The labels of products should include the local language. It is used, they also fund the production of mother tongue materials, dictionaries, and the training of daycare centers, which is under their jurisdiction. However, as there were trails, there were also perils or challenges that come with the broad implementation of MLE, like the following. There is an uneven implementation of MLE across the regions, the 17 regions. There's a strong reliance on the compliance discourse. So teachers, because they have to be compliant in a large organization, have to implement MLE without understanding what it is. And the implementation is also determined by the presence of champions and trained personnel. There's inadequate consultations and local ownership because the implementation was so rapid. So there was no time to interact with the local leaders. There's also a problem in how we define success and legitimacy. Is it literacy? Is MLE for literacy, identity, English proficiency? Is it to produce intellectualized Filipino? There are pressures to produce immediate success, especially because of this PISA, TIMSS, and CPLM, even when inputs are not yet in place. And this success has to be felt all over the Philippines, and it was very difficult. Materials, there's tension whether to use the child's everyday language or the idealized pure language preferred by the local writers and speakers. There's also the problem with providing adequate academic register in L1, especially terms for science and math. And there's the issues of standardization of dialects of a certain L1. So the push is to make it more inclusive rather than privileging one dialect. And the major problem is how to implement Mtbmle in linguistically diverse contexts, especially in urban areas where several L1s are spoken. As a whole, we see how the Ministry of Education and its community partners have been slowly embedding Mtbmle in their systems, in their everyday practices. We see how teachers from various places and advocates are showing dedication in using their capacities individually and collectively to make MLE work in various aspects. There is a current concern about the proposed bill by some congressmen to abrogate Mtbmle because they still believe that it is damaging our advantage in English. There is also this World Bank report that the 2-year school closures due to pandemic, we didn't have a limited face-to-face meeting, has produced widespread illiteracy among early graders. Given the many challenges, it is imperative that Filipino Mtbmle advocates to be steadfast, find spaces for convergence, and creatively respond to challenges based on sound and ethical principle. What is at stake here is not just the program, but our children's education and our cultural heritage. In closing, let me read the conclusion of an evaluation study on Mtbmle conducted by the Philippine Institute of Development Studies. The author said, notwithstanding the numerous problems it is facing, the Mtbmle has very solid pedagogical foundation. It embodies the concept of a learner-centered education. Thus, this study does not question the wisdom of implementing the program, but rather seeks to highlight the challenges it is facing with a view of seeking more effective, efficient, and acceptable ways of implementing the program. Overall, the program needs better appreciation of the conceptual problems it is facing and the cooperation of all stakeholders to be implemented well. So thank you, maraming salamat, and you can send your questions to my email.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chad. That was a very helpful conversation. And now we're going to move from the Philippines to Thailand. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, excellent. Well, it is good to be here and to see some familiar faces and names from when Dongzong took me to Kuala Lumpur, I guess about 3 years ago, well, right before the pandemic, so 2 years ago. And I really enjoyed my time there and learning more about the Malaysian situation. Now, when we first started talking about this conference, I thought I'd be doing a case study on the Bangkok Statement on Language and Inclusion, which is a document from UNESCO that was just developed and approved recently. However, then in June of this year, the Thai government made some very good and very encouraging decisions. So I decided, rather than just sticking with the Bangkok Statement, as my abstract said, to include some of these recent policy developments in Thailand that I hope you will all find encouraging. Let's see. Sorry about that. So if we talk about the status of language in Thailand, Thailand has had 20 national constitutions, but at least the more recent ones have never mentioned language. And maybe that's because the Thai language is so dominant and powerful that people feel there's no reason to even mention it in a constitution. To find a real statement of Thai as the national language, we have to go back to 1940 and State Convention number 9, which was declared by a very nationalist prime minister who declared Thai the national language and said all Thai people must extol, honor, and respect the Thai language and must feel honored to speak it. And also that everyone must hold it to be true that all born as Thai people have the same Thai blood and speak the same Thai language. Place of birth or accent makes no difference. So this was essentially saying we have unity because we are all the same. At least by definition, we are all the same, even though we might not really be the same. And it also puts a language variance as accents, not distinct languages. And this is something that we see, as Dr. Hugh mentioned and as Dr. Lobianco mentioned, especially in post-World War II nation building, there is a lot of this emphasis on having one national language and all the other languages being demoted to dialects or accents. I actually saw this about 15 years ago in a meeting, maybe it was 17 years ago. It was one of the deputy ministers of education of Malaysia. And when I asked him about linguistic diversity, he insisted that Malaysia only had, that only 3 real languages were spoken in Malaysia. All the rest were just dialects. And so since they were dialects, they could never be written down. And so they could never be used in school. And I don't mean to criticize him directly. This is the attitude that many policymakers have, reflecting often the dominant culture's view. So the reality in Thailand, as in Malaysia, is much more diverse. We have about 70 living languages. Now, some of them are very, very small languages and very endangered. Some only have a few hundred speakers left. But then there are others that are much larger. And those languages could definitely be used in education. And we have lots of data to support that children from those language groups are not doing very well in Thai schools. Now, so the Thai national language policy was drafted over the past several years by the Royal Institute of Thailand. And the Royal Institute plays a function very similar to Malaysia's Institute of Language and Literature. I think that's called Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation. And it was, this policy development was driven really by 3 sources. The first was an academic interest of professors and university researchers. A lot of them had gotten interested in endangered language revitalization, which was a big thing that emerged in the 1990s. They started attending conferences, many sponsored by the United Nations. And there was one in particular in 2006, and it actually was a dinner at the conference where Dr. Udom Waromakasadit, who's a very famous Thai linguist, passed away last year, unfortunately. But he was speaking with Dennis and Susan Malone, Kimmo Kosonen, and also an Australian linguist, David Bradley. And Dr. Udom realized, why does Thailand not have an up-to-date language policy? And so he sort of took it upon himself to work with the Royal Institute to develop one. And so eventually other agencies like the Ministry of Education, Mahidol University, Thailand Research Fund also joined in that. At the same time, there was the political situation was degenerating, particularly in the Deep South. And all of you in Malaysia are familiar with the Malay-speaking provinces of southern Thailand, predominantly Muslim, and the violence that had occurred there from 2004 onward. I think the latest count was about 7,000 people killed, including 180 teachers. And in response to that, the National Security Council, as well as the Ministry of Education, recommended bilingual education using the local variety of Malay. The only problem was that no one really knew how to do that or what that meant. And in fact, some of the early government efforts to use bilingual education actually made the children do worse in school, do worse on all their standardized testing because they were not using good MLE models. There was also a lot of international pressure on the ministry to address statelessness, ethnic minority and migrant children who did not have citizenship in any country. And many of those children were out of school. And also politically, they wanted better English and Chinese for the economy. Now, several pilot projects were developed in response. The most prominent one, as Dr. Lobianco mentioned, was the Mtbmle Mtb project in southern Thailand. Again, Mahidol University, UNICEF, Thailand Research Fund, and the Ministry of Education were all involved in that in the south. Meanwhile, in the north, several other languages started being used in MLE, supported mostly by foundations. So here are two case studies. You can see here is a picture from northern Thailand, where there are many schools, currently about, as Kimmo mentioned, about 8 languages being used, currently in 25 schools, but next year that will double because more and more schools are getting involved. And if you want to learn more of that, you can click on this link or scan that link. And then again, in southern Thailand, very close to your border, we have the UNICEF document that Kimmo mentioned, highlighting schools in the deep south. Originally 16 schools, now it's expanded somewhat to other schools that are using the MLE approach. And the approach as it's used in Thailand, very similar to the Philippines and Cambodia, is to build a two-way bridge, starting with the mother tongue of the children, whether Patani Malay or another language, building strong skills in listening, speaking, reading, and writing the mother tongue first, and then developing listening, speaking, reading, and writing in the national language or Thai. And again, this is the way we learn to learn language naturally, by listening before we speak and speaking before we read, and so forth. Contrasted to, say, English learning, where children are taught the ABCs first. And so the idea is that this will form a two-way bridge linguistically and culturally, where the children can achieve their potential in both languages. How that actually plays out in Thailand, kindergarten 1 and 2 is mostly in the mother tongue, then listening and speaking Thai is added. I would say that in the case of Patani Malay, their reading and writing of Patani Malay was all done in the Thai alphabet, a Thai-based orthography. Later on, in about grade 4, they learn the Rumi and Jawi orthographies for their language. So they'd be learning standard Malay in grade 4 and bridging to that. But the whole idea is that everything is sequenced and there's a bridging between languages. As is the case in the Philippines, all the materials were developed by local people working with Thai academics and NGOs and Ministry of Education officials to develop materials that would be very relevant using the local language, but also meeting the Ministry of Education standards for every grade, at least most of the standards, except some related to the Thai language. The results were very, very good. On this graph, you can see some children in the north, all the way grade through 1 to 5. Their performance on the national literacy evaluation was far superior to ethnic minority children who did not have MLE. And in the Deep South, again, superior performance all the way until grade 6. And that was because in grade 6, there's a national exam. So the teachers stopped using MLE and just taught the kids so they could do well on the exam. And unfortunately, as is often the case with national exams, it made the learning for everyone go down. So these pilot projects informed the national language policy drafting, which was very influenced by the Australian national policy. Again, as Dr. Lobianco mentioned, this policy was not about only minority languages. It was about the Thai language, regional languages, including Malay, languages of commerce, how to teach Thai to migrant workers, because there are many migrant workers here, incorporating sign language and Braille, as Dr. Ched mentioned, that was an issue in the Philippines as well as developing standards for translation. So it was a policy to address all the language issues. And it was based on multiple meetings, seminars, conferences, many stakeholders involved. The approval was sort of interesting because it was approved by 2 prime ministers, but they never took the policy before Parliament or the cabinet. So it was always a little unclear of its exact status. But finally, just a few months ago in June, the cabinet, the group of ministers, approved the National Language Policy Action Plan. And so at least for the next 2 years, this plan has been put in effect. And the plan is very supportive of mother tongue, seeing mother tongue as the strong foundation and linking it to the study and use of the Thai language. A goal of the plan is to promote the use of local languages in education alongside the Thai language. And an indicator to see if the plan is working will be to see an increase in the percentage of schools using a local language along with the Thai language. Now this policy is still just in Thai. This is a translation I did. Hopefully there will be an English translation soon we could share with you. At the same time the Royal Institute was developing its policy, the Ministry of Education was developing and modifying some of their policies and began to mention local languages a lot more in both the National Education Plan, their focus for 2020, and even in giving a few provinces like Chiang Mai in the far north, the right to do this innovation zone or this sandbox approach where the local officials can decide what language is appropriate in school. And that's one reason why we've seen so much growth in MLE in the north. Also, the Royal Society has now approved 10 Thai-based minority language orthographies, which again, they had never done before because they're only focused on the Thai language. So this is a really positive development that these languages can say, they have government approval. Of course, there are challenges. Most of this has come from the sides, from academics, NGOs, UNICEF. Later, the communities got involved, and finally the government. But it's still a little hard for the government to actively involve. Most of the time, it's either a local school or an NGO starting new projects and expanding it. There's also some questions about the budget. There is an early exit mentality. Kathleen Hugh talked about this. Some of the MLE programs end at the end of kindergarten, some at primary grade 3. There's also the challenge of teacher recruitment and training, also a challenge in the Philippines. Although recently, one Thai university has developed an online training program for teachers in the MLE methods. And that was just launched about 2 months ago. So we'll be excited to see how it works, and also if some of the things in that online MOOC could be used in neighboring countries. The Ministry of Education also co-chaired the Policymakers Forum, in which 16 countries endorsed the Bangkok Statement on Language and Inclusion. And this statement has also been translated into Malay by the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education organization, coordinated that translation. So you can see that there. This Policymakers Forum started informally and sort of based on what Dr. Lobianco said about learning to speak the language of policymakers. We had them do some little games with their phones on Mentimeter just to find out how much the policymakers knew. We were very surprised that most of them did know how many languages their countries had. We weren't very surprised that most of them said that not many languages are included in education. We then had 3 sessions with some experts. First, Dr. Dina Ocampo, who is a former Deputy Minister of Education in the Philippines, was able to speak the policymakers' language and explain from inside her ministry how MLE policies were developed. This was followed by Manuel Cardoso from UNICEF, who's an expert in statistics, especially UNICEF's Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, or MIX, which now includes some information on literacy, which I don't know if they've used that module in Malaysia or not, but here in Thailand, the literacy and numeracy part of MIX has really helped show how Indigenous children are behind in their learning. He also showed this slide from another report, which showed that mother tongue instruction was found to be the most cost-effective of many, many different educational innovations. And so again, many policymakers think MLE will be too expensive, but in fact, it can be, it's not very expensive and it has a large impact. Also, Carol Benson from Columbia University talked about MLE teaching. And so this gave the policymakers an opportunity to ask questions in a very private setting where no one would lose face. The policy, the Bangkok statement itself, the preamble is sort of saying these ideas are not new. They've been discussed in many other meetings over the past 20 years. The second section was saying what Kimmo was saying, diversity is real in Southeast Asia. There are no monolingual countries, and the diversity impacts learning. Then it goes into some general principles about MLE, the importance of the mother tongue. And finally, an action plan. And in this action plan, the 16 countries committed, this is sort of like a checklist of things they committed to do to help bring more inclusive education to their countries. And as I've shared this with NGOs and others, I've said, you know, this is where NGOs can really engage the governments that have signed or endorsed this statement by helping them to do these things, because most of the governments in this area really lack the expertise on how to implement MLE. So conclusions, first of all, with the Bangkok statement, it's very focused on quality education for all children. It doesn't really talk about rights, because we felt that especially here in Asia, policymakers respond negatively if you start talking about new human rights for special groups like minority groups. We hope that it will be a useful advocacy tool. You can look up the Malay translation and see what you think. Also, next year, UNESCO will host the second Asia Pacific Regional Education Ministerial Conference. Usually about 30 to 40 countries attend this. And during that conference, countries will be invited to endorse the Bangkok statement. So perhaps some of you in Malaysia could even talk to your Ministry of Education beforehand to let them know that this is coming and let them know about the interest that all of you have in this issue and how all of you are very happy to help the government to understand and implement MLE more widely. As far as Thailand, again, the policy really gives more space to NGOs and local schools, not as much support from the government. We really have a big barrier or challenge to strengthen teacher recruitment, training, and deployment. But I would say that the fact that you in Malaysia are interested in the Thai policy, the Cambodian, the Philippines policies, this really helps us all, because you know, I can go to the Thai government and say, Malaysia is very interested in what you're doing here. And the Philippines has used examples from Thailand and Cambodia with the Filipino government to show them what else is going on. So I think we can all cooperate to help all of our respective governments see the importance of Mtbmle. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirk. And I apologize. My computer froze between, you know, chats and your presentation, and I had to reboot. And so I couldn't introduce you. I apologize for that. Now it's time to move on to Cambodia. And we have Jessica Ball, Dr. Jessica Ball, joining us from Victoria, Western Canada. Over to you.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, but maybe you turn on the presentation mode. Thank you.
All right.
Perfect.
Well, thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I'd like to begin, as we do in Canada, by acknowledging with respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose unceded traditional lands the university where I work stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic First Nations, on whose land I've been an invited guest for the past 25 years. Today, my focus is on the MLE activity going on in Cambodia. A brief overview of what I'll talk about. I'll mention a little bit about the language landscape in Cambodia, the MLE implementation timeline, motivation for MLE, the MLE National Action 5-year plans, the choice of MLE model, the evaluation of the first 5-year plan, some of the findings from the evaluation, and some of the recommendations. So the dominant language in Cambodia is Kamae. looks like Khmer, but it's pronounced Kamae, and it's spoken by about 93% of citizens. And there are at least 26 non-dominant languages, including French, English, Cham, Vietnamese, Lao, Chinese, and several indigenous languages. So the government's MLE initiative right now only applies to 6 indigenous languages: Bunong, Tampuan, Kavet, Brau, Krong, and Jarai. And the MLE initiative only applies to the 5 northeastern provinces of Cambodia. This is the area where the largest number of indigenous people in Cambodia live. And so the MLE policy is only for those provinces. Before MLE, it was widely acknowledged that indigenous children were disadvantaged because the language they speak at home was not the language used as a language of instruction in school. Enrollment, attendance, and progress of indigenous children was much lower than the national average. And parents didn't understand the value of formal education because they couldn't understand the teacher's language or the Kamae curriculum. And many parents said that back in those days, we thought formal schooling is just not for our communities. So now we have some MLE activity happening in Cambodia, and I'd just like to highlight some of the milestones in bringing this initiative along. In the mid-1990s, indigenous languages started to be used in non-formal education with various pilot projects by INGOs, particularly CARE International and the International Cooperation Cambodia organization, along with government partners in the sense that these pilot projects were allowed to happen in the northeastern provinces. At the same time, there was work on developing the orthographies for several indigenous languages. And it should be noted that the indigenous languages are using the Kamae orthography. And so that over a period of more than a decade, 5 indigenous languages, and most recently 2 other indigenous languages, have had their orthographies approved by the Royal Academy and by the government. And at the same time, literacy materials in the indigenous languages were being developed. And then from 2002, bilingual education was demonstrated in the formal education system in just a handful of government schools by CARE International in association with government partners. And these were very important pilot projects because their success really paved the way for the 2007 education law that gave local authorities the right to choose the languages of instruction in areas where non-dominant languages are being spoken. In 2010, the government published guidelines on the implementation of bilingual education programs for indigenous children in those 5 highland provinces. In 2013, the bilingual education decree allowed the use of indigenous languages along with Kamae. And that really opened the door to the first 5-year government-owned multilingual education national action plan. And when that was completed, the successes of that further paved the way for another 5-year plan, the 2019 to 2023 Multilingual Education Action Plan, which is essentially a continuation of the first 5-year plan, with 2 more indigenous languages allowed to be used. At this time, only 1 additional indigenous language is being used. So a total of 6 indigenous languages are involved now. Now, I won't go over this whole timeline, but it'll be in the slides for those of you that are interested. But I think the main thing that we're seeing here is that it took about 10 years of work by language advocacy groups, supported by non-government organizations and international non-government organizations, before the government took ownership of the MLE. And along the way, it was like a door cracked open around 2002. And then by 2015, it really was more widely opened. And so that the government, articulated enabling education guidelines and laws that made it possible for MLE to be institutionalized in many of the government schools in the 5 northeastern provinces. So in 2016, the Minister of Education, Youth and Sport made a very important statement. The multilingual education program, is essential to reach the sustainable development goals for inclusive and equitable quality education in Cambodia. It serves as a bridge for Cambodian children who do not speak Khmer at home and allows Indigenous children to learn in school effectively and understand what their teachers say in the classroom. So that's a very strong, positive statement coming right from the Minister of Education. So the goal of both the national action plans is to increase access to meaningful education of Indigenous girls and boys by providing them with multilingual education in preschool and in the first 3 years of primary school. As I mentioned, the first 5-year plan encompassed 5 Indigenous languages, and the second 5-year plan encompasses 6 Indigenous languages. Now, the government built on the MLE delivery systems that had been established by CARE International in terms of introducing the provincial officers of education, the district level officers of education, and various like school cluster leaders and village head people, introducing them to MLE, what it is, how it works, what are the goals, and how teachers can be trained to do it. Cambodia's current MLE model is a short exit or bridging model. And Professor Hugh reviewed the different kinds of models. And this one is quite a truncated model. Ideally, what is supposed to happen is that in preschool, in MLE preschool, children learn 100% in their mother tongue. And then by primary 1, they're learning 80% in the mother tongue, and 20% they're being exposed to learning Kamae. In primary 2, 60% in the mother tongue, primary 3, 30% in the mother tongue, and then they're expected to transition to 100% Kamae language of instruction by primary 4. So this is a typical short exit or bridging model, and as we know from as Professor Hugh highlighted, there are various models of MLE. Cambodia's model is known as the short exit bilingual transitional model, and children switch to instruction in the dominant language in primary 4. Research supports a late exit or long-term bilingual or multilingual model, where children switch to instruction they switch to instruction in the dominant language after they are able to read to learn, usually after primary 6. So that's what the research supports, this longer term model. And we don't know what will be the learning outcomes of the short exit model. But still, an opportunity to start school in a language spoken at home has encouraged enrollment and learning engagement in Cambodia. Nevertheless, children are not likely to become literate in their home language in a short-term model. Now, we know this from other research. We also know that in Cambodia, Kamae is a notoriously difficult orthography to learn. And so many of the children are just beginning to learn to write in Kamae in late primary 2 and in primary 3. And so they're not likely to become literate in their Indigenous language before primary 3. A culturally rich curriculum is important for MLE, and for the first 3 years of primary school, the MLE teachers are using a customized MLE curriculum that is rich with culturally based content created by CARE in consultation with Indigenous peoples. The MLE curriculum is the same for all Indigenous language groups, which share a highland setting and livelihoods involving non-timber forestry and farming. So there is a lot of content that that is relevant across the different groups. But at the same time, supplementary books have been developed that are specific to each Indigenous language group, illustrating specific cultural knowledge, traditions, and practices in the local community. An evaluation of the first 5-year plan was commissioned by UNICEF on behalf of the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sport. And it was conducted by myself and Mariam Smith and 9 Indigenous team members. And we visited many primary schools, MLE schools and non-MLE schools and preschools in 4 of the provinces that were most actively taking up the MLE initiative. We talked to a lot of people through focus groups and interviews and outcome harvesting workshops, and almost 1,000 people took part in some way in the evaluation, including many children and their parents. So I'll just highlight some of the findings. One of the findings is that MLE is effective. MLE produced significant increases in school enrollment, attendance, active participation in class, and parents' involvement on school support committees. So this graph just shows the solid lines are children in MLE schools, and you see this dramatic increase in enrollment, particularly in 2 of the 4 provinces. And the dotted lines show, changes in enrollment in the non-MLE schools. So you can see there's a, very dramatic jump in engagement with the formal education system on the part of Indigenous children and their families that had access to MLE classrooms. The evaluation showed that the MLE preschools can be effective, but had not yet really shown their potential. We found that MLE preschool teachers and facilities needed state support and could not only be relying on community support. The MLE preschools needed to be linked geographically and functionally to the primary schools that were delivering MLE. And that was often not the case. And the MLE preschool teachers need MLE teacher training and materials. So generally the MLE preschools were just left too much on their own to figure things out for themselves. And in Cambodia, a 2019 law has offered a new framework to help achieve these aims. MLE increased awareness and demand. Demand for MLE among parents, school principals, and district education officers far exceeded the supply of qualified Indigenous teachers. Teacher training institutes had not yet been brought on side to deliver the MLE training. And so that was a recommendation, strong recommendation coming out of the evaluation. Teachers for MLE need to be proficient speakers of the non-dominant language. So the idea of teachers, Kamae teachers learning and trying to learn an Indigenous language and becoming really proficient in it, and then teaching in the MLE classrooms, it was not very successful. But there were plenty of teachers who speak an Indigenous language who wanted to be involved in delivering MLE in the communities. Another finding was that, we talk a lot about the language of instruction, but what really came through in this evaluation is that the language and culture go hand in hand. And Indigenous people, especially the children, greatly value seeing themselves reflected in the activities, problems, and solutions that are portrayed in the curriculum. In addition to providing a curriculum that represents the livelihoods and relevant local knowledge of non-dominant language groups, MLE teachers can be supported to generate locally relevant teaching and learning materials and activities. Indigenous people, came out strongly saying that they're very keen to partner with technical resource people to ensure authentic, relevant, and enriched cultural content. So when we think about MLE, it's important to think about the content of curriculum and making sure that that is relevant to the populations that we're hoping to support in their engagement with formal education. Another thing was that children, parents, and village leaders and education officers at the district and provincial levels saw the positive impact of MLE and advocated for extending MLE to at least primary 6. And the children were the best ambassadors of MLE, and they said that they wanted to learn how to design and make farming implements and traditional musical instruments, to know more about forest ecologies, sustaining native plants, raising and caring for animals, and all kinds of things that they wanted to continue to learn by continuing further in their education in MLE. And most of all, they wanted to learn to write in their language. Another finding was the importance of subnational education officers and district officers who benefit from ongoing support to understand MLE. There was a strong demand from these people for more training and mentoring about what are the goals of MLE, how does it work, what are the teacher training requirements, what is the unique curriculum and needs, and what are the implications for their mentoring and monitoring of MLE teachers in classrooms. So, a recommendation was that subnational educators need sufficient technical support in an ongoing way, and this should be arranged at the national level. It should be pointed out that in Cambodia, a decade of care work with subnational educators in 2 provinces was reflected in outstanding achievements in Indigenous children's school enrollment and success in those 2 provinces. And these successes encouraged subnational educators to increase awareness of MLE with teachers and parents, and to advocate with the national government for MLE school expansion. And then our evaluation looked at costs. In Cambodia, significant upfront costs were borne by INGOs, mainly by CARE International. And that was mainly to create the MLE curriculum in consultation with Indigenous people, to create MLE teacher training pre-service and in-service modules, to train Indigenous language speakers to become core teacher trainers. But then after that, one of the principals of an MLE school said, after the program has been developed, the cost of training teachers and delivering MLE is not that much more than non-MLE. But we need to be sure that MLE inception and implementation plans are costed. Of course, we also have to keep in mind what Professor Hugh highlighted about the non-monetary costs of not delivering education in a language that children can understand, including their low attainment, low employment, low participation in civil society, and so on. Now, some unanticipated findings were that Indigenous parents became more engaged in bringing their children to school, taking an interest in homework, and participating in school support committees. The adults are now seeking help to become literate in their languages. The national capacity to lead MLE was behind the provincial education authorities, pointing to an ongoing need for adequate technical support to leadership and strategic recruiting at the national level, including members of the language groups intended to benefit. Now, what about Kamae, the dominant language? Parents and village leaders said that children are happy to learn Kamae, but they need MLE to become proficient in their Indigenous language, which is important for the survival of their culture and language. And they pointed out that due to the high in-migration of Kamae people into traditionally Indigenous communities, children are exposed to Kamae in their everyday lives. Parents and teachers pointed out that MLE is producing higher enrollment and more children advancing to higher grades, so that they're more likely to attend secondary school where Kamae is the language of instruction. In other words, once they've become literate in their first language, they'll be ready to engage fully in learning the national language. So Cambodia, in conclusion, is showing some of the promise of MLE in achieving its goals for education and development. And this diagram illustrates what some of the outcomes can be from MLE. A couple of things I'd just like to highlight that were insights from our evaluation. And one is the need to pay attention to the actors in MLE implementation. And in this diagram, the cross-hatched lines show the sphere of formal education. And we often just focus on that sphere, you know, who are going to be the teachers, the teacher trainers, the technical specialists, the national and provincial and district educational leaders and officers. But there are a host of other people that I think in Ched's presentation, she called them the community of support for Mtbmle. A number of other people, including, of course, the children themselves and their parents, village leaders, all the speakers of non-dominant languages, orthographers, researchers, and other people who are very important in raising awareness and increasing demand for Mtbmle, and who play a very significant role at all levels of MLE implementation. Another insight was that this diagram, this tree shows the 10 essential elements. The leaves show the 10 essential elements that Susan Malone conceptualized and published through UNESCO in a very useful toolkit called Mtbmle implementation. So yes, the evaluation confirmed that these 10 elements are very important. But our evaluation also underscored the importance of partnership with non-dominant language speakers and organizations. And this was really came out strongly in talking with community language groups and the Indigenous peoples organizations in Cambodia, who had said that they really had felt very sidelined in the development of the MLE policy and the rollout of MLE. And they wanted to be more involved and, you know, in curriculum development, in promoting Mtbmle in the communities and so on. So that seems to be like really the root to me of Mtbmle is the infusion of input from non-dominant language speakers and groups themselves. Another thing was the need for visible and collaborative leadership, especially at the national level. And many people in the community said they wanted to hear more from the national level, you know, really reassuring them that Mtbmle really was allowed. And then ongoing adequate financial and technical resources. So as I mentioned, the subnational educators said that they wanted ongoing in-service about MLE and what it is and how it can work and what they can do to support it. So those are the highlights of the what's happening in Cambodia and our evaluation findings. Terima kasih banyak, Sheshe. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Jessica. And just a reminder that there are reports available online on all of these themes that we talked about. And I will just quickly share the screen so that you can see that or maybe scan the QR code for these reports. Are they visible now? Mtbmle report and the Cambodia report. You can also Google them and find them, use some of the key search terms. We also had links to my paper, the UNESCO paper, which is a little dated, but gives an overview of these issues in all the 11 countries, as well as a website where Ched has lots of presentations and other materials on multilingual education in the Philippines. And of course, later on, you will have access to all of these PowerPoints. But for now, if you want to know more, please scan those links. Let's go now to questions. And there's already been about 7 questions in the Mentimeter platform. And Chet, are you online? Can you turn on your camera as well? And Jessica too. And I'm not going to read the questions there. Some of those questions were asked during my presentation or when Chet was presenting, and we've actually got answers, replies to those in the subsequent presentations. But so I'll try to summarize some of the issues, and let's have a little bit of dialogue about it. There was a very interesting question about that what is being done regionally through ASEAN or CMIO to share these good experiences from Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand with other Southeast Asian countries. And I just put a link to a report that CMIO produced 11 years ago on this, called Mother Tongue as a Bridge Language of Instruction. So you can find the link there. But that was 11 years ago. And now question to the panelists is that what is happening regionally right now to influence those governments where there's less MLE implementation currently? Who wants to start?
Maybe, Kimmo, I could just add, since you had mentioned the CMIO, the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, they also last year issued a report, Southeast Asian Primary Learning Metrics, or sometimes CPLM, and maybe in a minute I'll try to find the link to that. But in that report, they did look at language in at least a few countries, not all the countries, but they did find that definitely children from non-dominant language groups are behind in literacy and numeracy throughout the region. So that's another report that could be useful for advocacy. And we're very thankful that the current Secretary General of CMIO here in Bangkok, Dr. Ethel rather, from the Philippines, is very supportive of Mtbmle. CMIO did help translate the Bangkok statement into a couple languages from the region, and it may be included in their future meetings. They were trying to get it on the agenda for future ministerial meetings.
And there was also a question about the Bangkok statement, and I put the link into the chat box where you log into that site, and then you can find all the translations. There's about 7, I think, into Southeast Asian languages, including Bahasa Malaysia. Chet or Jessica, you want to add something on this regional, sharing of information and advocacy?
Maybe during UNESCO MLE conferences, there are opportunities for conversation. And I think that's where, opportunities to influence policy, but I don't know about at senior level what they're doing to influence other countries that are not involved in MLE. However, I'd like to address Kimmo, is it okay?
Okay, well, I mean, I just want to hear from Jessica as well, because I know you've worked in several Southeast Asian countries. Malaysia was, maybe years ago, but you've more recently worked in Myanmar and in Cambodia. And was there any connection between those countries or situations?
No, I don't think I should comment on, I think that Joe, Professor Lobianco has given a good insight into the more current language learning landscape in Myanmar.
Okay, thank you. So Chet, you have something else to add on this, because I have two other major questions.
Nothing more.
Okay, well, in Mentimeter, the most popular question was about teachers, MLE teachers, their recruitment, their training, and their assignment later on to serving communities where their language skills and proficiency can be used. I think that all 3 of you gave very good, reports on what's happening in those countries, but can you very quickly just summarize, because I think some people have missed that part of your presentation, that how are people from non-dominant communities recruited, trained, and used as teachers in these countries? Very quickly. Who wants to start? Chet?
Well, we have colleges and universities in all regions. And so that's where we recruit teachers, the graduates of that colleges. But there are some communities that do not produce licensed teachers. They have graduates, but they do not pass the licensure exam. And so the government is making some arrangement, like they serve as teacher assistants or tutors. But that's an area that we want to focus on the small indigenous communities, because the large ones, the more powerful, the more educated ones in the north are doing okay. But we have to identify the smaller ones.
Thailand?
Yes. So in the South, most of the teachers are from our Malay speakers, Patani Malay speakers, as are most of the students. And in one of the regional universities, Yala Ratchapat University, all education students studying pre-primary or primary are required to take an MLE class. In the North, it's much more difficult because there are very few teachers, because it's hard for ethnic minority young people to pass the teacher's certificate exam and then compete with all the Thai students. Unfortunately, Thailand has started a group called the Equitable Education Fund, and the EEF is trying to recruit local, they call them homegrown teachers, and then those locally recruited students will not have to compete on the national teachers exam. They'll be assigned to schools in their home area. So that's a good start. It needs to be expanded.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here about Cambodia. It's really quite challenging. There are 2 teacher training colleges in 2 out of the 5 provinces where the MLE policy is applicable. And some of the MLE teachers are Indigenous people who went to those teacher training colleges, especially in Ratanakiri. There's quite, in one of the provinces, there's a high level of Indigenous people that go to the teacher training college. So some of them are trained teachers who then become, who then get an in-service training that through modules that CARE International developed. And so far, to my knowledge, there's been no pre-service MLE teacher training. But some Indigenous people who are teachers have then got the MLE training. On the other hand, we did meet teachers who only had primary 5 or 6 education themselves. And these were in, some of I can't tell you what it took to get. I know Komiak Joe showed me some of the pictures from in Borneo of trying to get to some of these really remote schools. And in these really, really remote schools, Indigenous, the teachers were often recruited by district education officers. And there again, they would get the in-service MLE training. But they really needed so much more than they had. I mean, they were barely keeping up with the children themselves. And so, it's historically that, there's been so little Indigenous engagement in the formal education system that there isn't a wealth of Indigenous people who've completed, who've met the criteria to get into teacher training colleges yet. So it will take some years, I think, before there's really a pipeline of Indigenous people who've completed all of the criteria in order to enter the teacher training colleges, unless there was some kind of streamlined, cohort-based, flexible admission policy for, to support MLE. We did that here in Canada. And so, yeah, right now, and although there are pre-service modules that have been developed, they have not yet been deployed.
Thank you, Jessica. I ran a workshop to Indigenous Peoples Association in Cambodia earlier this year in May and June. And I learned then that there are plans to have a center of excellence for MLE teachers and sort of like a teacher training college that would particularly target people from non-dominant language backgrounds. And I've understood that both Ministry of Education and UNICEF and CARE International are involved in some discussions. I don't know how far they are, but there are plans to strengthen teacher training in Cambodia. One thing we should remember, though, is that when those early pilots in the 90s started in Cambodia, Jessica already referred to them, in many of the non-dominant language communities in the Northeast, no one had ever spent a year or even a day in school in formal education. So you started from a clean plate and zero literacy rate in any language. And so 25 years later, we shouldn't expect miracles, but we already have some MLE teachers in Eastern Cambodia who were students in those early pilots. And so there's already a second generation of people who have experience in MLE. And in some cases, maybe in those places in Borneo you just talked about, Jessica, maybe, it will take a bit of time until we can have a teaching force from those groups. Finally, I want to comment on few countries that I will not mention. I said that I've done some work in all of the 11, and in one country in particular, this was 10 years ago, I asked about this, that why were the trained teachers from non-dominant communities not assigned in communities where that language was spoken? And the ministry officials said they couldn't understand the question. They said, well, why would we put them there? What's the point? And I said, don't you agree that it's better that a teacher can speak a language with the students? And they said they just couldn't see it. We said that we provide equal education to everyone in this country. And so all the teachers are equal, all the students are equal, and we shouldn't pay attention to the background. And I'm so happy to hear that in Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines, this issue is being addressed. Okay, let's move on. We have another 15 minutes. I'm combining some of the questions that are there. And one very interesting comment was that someone said that how can the Philippines have progressed a lot, but how was that possible without any government support and help? And I think the person misunderstood what you were presenting, Ched, but can you comment on what was the role of the government in making MLE possible in the country?
Yeah, remember that we implemented it in all 50,000, almost 50,000 villages. So it couldn't happen without government support. So government provided major policies plus smaller policies for implementation, so that it can be operationalized in all areas. So I appreciate the MLE advocates within the Ministry of Education or Department of Education. Without them, it would be difficult for us. So and then their number is increasing. Before we had only a handful of advocates within the ministry, but now we have people in the region, division, and there are second generation advocates, those who were influenced by the first generation. So I think there's a strong, depending also on the Minister of Education and the President. So we enjoy strong support during the time of President Aquino. The next president just maintained what was started.
Okay, thank you. Jessica or Kirk, you want to comment on this? The role of the government, or could this happen without some support from the government or some policies?
Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, let's move on then, because there's one very interesting question. I think that will take some time to discuss. And someone is asking that how have the dominant communities in all these three countries become aware and perhaps supportive of MLE and the use of non-dominant languages. Can you comment on the role of the dominant community, however you want to define it? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that we did come across some Kamae children who were in the MLE classrooms and enjoying. The parents of those children said they were enjoying that their children were learning the Indigenous language, because they were now living on what has historically been Indigenous traditional territories. These families are now, migrating into these areas, and they thought it was great that the children were learning the language so that they could get along and communicate and make friends with the Indigenous children and their families. But it remains the case that most of the MLE classrooms are in MLE schools, and quite segregated from, geographically and in terms of the education, quite separate from Kamae dominant communities. So I doubt that very many Kamae people, even in those 5 northeastern provinces, are even aware that MLE is happening, or would take much interest in it.
Okay.
Yeah,
The Philippines. By the way, can you define who would be the dominant community in the Philippines?
Well, the most dominant are the Filipino or Tagalog speakers, and then there are other maybe 8 regional or languages in the regions, like Binisayang, Cebuanong Binisaya, Ilocano, Bicol, Kapampangan. I think what motivated them to join the MLE movement, as you defined it, is because of the threat of English. MLE became a policy when the president issued an order to use English only. And so they felt that their languages or Filipino is being minimized or ignored, So because of that, they wanted to create a strong discourse. The former discourse of using national language was, had problems, and it was opposed by other ethnic groups. But they wanted, so there was a need for a more inclusive campaign to include other languages. Another aspect also is these regional languages are located in places where there are indigenous groups. So they felt like, they had to take care, help these indigenous groups in developing their teachers, materials. So there's a sense of solidarity with the indigenous groups in their region.
Kirk, Thailand?
Yes, well, I think we've learned some lessons, as Dr. Joe Lobianco was saying, about how to speak the language of policymakers and really the different groups in society. When MLE started, the message that the MLE people put out was, we are here to save endangered languages. And, from the government's perspective, well, they're endangered, they're going to die anyway, why save them? So then we learned that in talking to parents and community leaders, we needed to talk about how MLE will help maintain your language, the children will respect your culture, and it will help them learn Thai and get better jobs later. Talking to policymakers, the message was, this will contribute to social cohesion, and most importantly, the children will learn the national language much, much better. We also have benefited from some good media relations. One of the Thai government TV stations did a 12-part series on ethnic minority groups in Thailand, and they highlighted MLE. It's also been mentioned in newspapers. So, not everyone knows about MLE, but more people do than in the past.
Thank you. We still have 9 minutes, and apparently there is a person who wants to ask a question orally. So Joanna Smith, if you are available, can you please turn on your mic and ask a question? Joanna Smith, are you are you in this session? Okay, well, why don't you hold? I mean, we have 2 more questions here, and I will give you time after we've done another round. There were several questions about, different documents or meetings coming up, and I think all the information that we have available are now in the chat box, so we're not going to cover them here. There's 2 very interesting questions that we could discuss as a panel. And one is that what happens in those non-dominant language communities where language shift has occurred, so that the people are ethnically, something else than the dominant group, but their main language is the dominant language, and they may not even, younger generations may not even speak the heritage language. And so what, can you comment on these situations and whether they exist here in those 3 countries, and what can MLE do to help them learn better and reach their full potential? Anyone?
In my experience, we identified one dying language in the north and called Iwak. And so I brought my students there, and we created big books with the remaining speakers. And so these are beautiful storybooks. And then later on, they were shared and they were displayed in the provincial library, and it created awareness because the head of the library and the museum displayed it online just a few weeks ago. And I think, they have to be demonstrated. The beauty and of this language has to be demonstrated to create awareness. So I think MLE is creating awareness about the situation of these smaller languages. In terms of their inclusion in the MLE program, well, it depends really on the community, because the Indigenous Education Office has its own principles, which runs parallel to Mtbmle. So this is the situation in the Philippines. We have MLE, then Indigenous People's Education. So here in the Indigenous People's Education, they're very conscious of the voices of the elders. So it depends on the elders if they want to revive their language or if they prefer to use another language in the region. So that's what's happening.
Well, I'll just jump in here about Cambodia. In our evaluation in all of our travels around the northeastern provinces, we did not encounter the language shift. The children in MLE were using the language that was spoken by their parents, the language that they had been socialized into from birth. But I will say that the parents were so excited. They clearly conveyed that they had an attitude that their language was just going to fade away until MLE. And they kept saying, until MLE. And now we have hope, and they also pointed out that, they said our language is dynamic and our culture is dynamic and changing. And, now with MLE, we can work with the teachers. Many of them have very close relationships with the MLE teachers to, ensure that what the teachers are teaching is also dynamic and reflects contemporary Indigenous culture and contemporary Indigenous language. And so it was really exciting for them. But I mean, the language shift, I'm very deeply immersed in that here in Canada, where the vast majority of Indigenous children and youth did not grow up hearing their Indigenous language at all. And so we're really working very hard. And I'll put a couple of links in the chat about, trying to produce proficient Indigenous language speakers at adults. Our focus right now is on adults, so that we have more Indigenous adult language proficient adults who can become teachers. And there's a growing number of heritage language preschools and a few wonderful examples of Indigenous language primary schools here in Canada.
Thank you, Jessica. We only have few minutes. So Joanna Smith, are you online, and can you please ask your question very quickly? Okay, nothing. So fine. So if I may continue on the language shift, because well, I can give you an example from Vietnam. I worked there with UNICEF and UNESCO 15 and 10 years ago, looking at language policies and MLE implementation. I wrote 2 long reports. What was interesting is that they disaggregated their educational achievement data in Vietnam 15 years ago based on nationality. So that's an ethnic group. But the challenge in Vietnam and Laos and mainland China, for example, is that there are official nationalities classified by the government, but that doesn't match the linguistic background of the groups. That sometimes like 5 different language communities are given one title, that you are Thai, for example, but you speak different languages. And so that caused a lot of confusion that, and it's the same in some other countries too, that planners should pay attention that no matter what the people are ethnically, we should determine what are the first languages, the mother tongues of the learners. And for multilingual people, it doesn't really matter which of the first languages you use. You can still study through all of those languages, any of those languages, but we have to know what languages the children speak. And very few countries, apart from one province in Vietnam and the whole country of Timor-Leste, have conducted a survey where they actually mapped what languages children speak and what their proficiency is in. But finally, just to conclude, that ethnicity or the name of the ethnic community and their linguistic proficiency does not always match. And we have to know what languages the children speak in order to plan a good quality education for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I could sort of
Finally, this is the final point, by the way, because we have to conclude.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And that's where the confusion about what a mother tongue is comes into place. I talked to a policymaker from Indonesia, and he said, well, I don't speak my mother tongue. Only my grandparents spoke my mother tongue. And so he was misunderstanding the heritage language of his ethnicity with what he actually spoke. So yeah, especially with policymakers, to be careful to explain what the mother tongue or first language actually is. And it might not be the same as the grandparents' language.
Thank you, Kirk, Chet, and Jessica. We covered almost all of the questions that were asked. We didn't have time for all of them. There's one more question, by the way, about that. What are the benefits of Mtbmle helping students learn the second language? And we don't have time to discuss that, but there are a number of resources available. If you log into that website, the Asia Pacific Multilingual Education Working Group website, you can download various materials. For example, that Mtbmle advocacy kit that Dr. Jessica referred to by Susan Malone gives you all kinds of, it gives you justification for these models and reasons and conclusions and analysis. So thank you all. I think this was a great way to discuss these things, and I'm so happy that Zoom worked and we had enough bandwidth. And thank you all. Terima kasih banyak. And now back to Kayan.
Thank you. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Jessica, Dr. Chet, Dr. Kirk, and also Dr. Kimmo for the eye-opening sharing. And thank you to Dr. Kimmo for chairing the session and making the session a smooth and a very successful one. So ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our second day of International Conference on Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education 2021. So on behalf of Dongzong, Keara Baru, and IPPN, I wish to thank you for making time in your busy schedule to join us here in this wonderful morning. And please be reminded that upon the approval of the speakers, the Secretariat will upload the slideshows to the official website, in which a link of the website can be found in the chat box. So our conference is adjourned to 9 a.m. tomorrow, in which we will have Dr. Maya Kamdani David, Honorary Professor, Asia Europe Institute from University of Malaya, to speak on challenges facing mother tongue-based multilingual education in Malaysia tomorrow at 9 a.m. So we look forward to see you tomorrow. Thank you, goodbye, and have a nice day.